speaker for tonight.
Thanks. Just had to start the camera there. Okay. How many people here have been to Proach models? Oh, you have to go. You do. It's just down on Sechelt Road. And he's been building scale models since he was 11 years old, graduating from space modeling at the time of the Apollo 11 lunar landing in '69. Real adventure began in 1971 when he built a small model of the Lunar Rover prior to the flight of Apollo 15 to the moon in late July of that year. He told CTV about it, and before he realized that he was building the entire Apollo 15 landing site for the networks used during their coverage of the moon mission. What followed were a number of projects through the 70s and 80s, some of which seemed impossible for a guy to just work out of the back room or his garage. In '85, he built 2 automated Anik communication satellites for Telesat Canada, which showed how the satellite deployed in space. For Expo 86, he built a 16-foot long model of the original U.S. space station along with a 28.5-foot model of the Canadian communications satellite, and both were in the Canadian pavilion at Expo 86. And in '94, he put his knowledge of space flight and space hardware with his expertise of model making together to form Proach models, a company in Sechelt dedicated to space flight by creating the most detailed, most sought-after museum and desktop model replicas of anything that flies or will fly in space. Since then, he has built or managed projects for NASA, Spacex, the U.S. Air Force, movies, museums, corporations, countless private collectors worldwide, and even former astronauts. Nick also toured many of the main U.S. space facilities, such as as a space flight historian, has a vast knowledge and library of records from all manned and unmanned space flights, along with an extensive print and video library. You really have to go and see his shop down there. It's a museum. It's amazing. He's a former radio newsman and disc jockey. He makes his talks positive, inspiring, and very informative. Take it away.
Charles. Thank you all for being here tonight. I hope I will be able to inspire and have you real interested in not only what I do now, what we do as a small company here on the coast, but our plans for the near future as well. We'll talk about that later on. We did an open house in July commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing on the moon. And at that time, I was inundated with one question, and one question only. How did you ever get started in this? And as during the time, I had decided to, rather than write a book, do a speaking thing where I can do speaking engagements. I still, right now, don't have the time to sit down and do a book. It's being talked about as to how we would do it. But the question, how did I get started on this, inspired the first of 3 topics that I would do on a speaking circuit. And the particular one I wanted to bring to you tonight was a really detailed version of what Charles outlined. And I simply call that Tales from the Workbench, because that's where everything starts. It starts at the workbench for me, and it goes up from there. And it's gone on to some pretty exciting places, and it's put me in front of some pretty exciting people, and therefore I've seen a lot of exciting things. And I've been in places where the American public would not be in, would not get to see. But that's what the last 25 years has done as Proach models. But the story of Proach models goes way back to 1971. Just before we get to that, you can see just here a small collage of the last 25 years where we were at the private family ceremonies of the, Apollo 1 commemoration in 1997. That's where the commemorated where 3 astronauts died on the pad fire in 1967. my first meeting, the second picture on the left there, the first time I actually met a group of astronauts at once, back in '96. My few moments with Walter Cronkite at CNN during the coverage of the John Glenn launch in 1998. And then we did a bunch of models for HBO's From the Earth to the Moon. We'll talk about that. We did supply models to the news media at the time of the Columbia accident in 2003. And the very last picture is one of the earliest pictures of me when I was 21, and I rented my model of the Apollo Soyuz test project out to CTV, which they used in their nationwide coverage of the first time the US and USSR met in space for the very first time. And I will get used to these keys. There we go. How did this all start? What started this? And I have to tell you, I have the odd moment where I kind of wonder about that myself. But it started in 1971 with this little guy, model of the Lunar Rover, which measured about maybe just over 3 inches long, about 2 inches across its wheels. And the one I built in 1971 didn't look as nice as this little guy. I have 2 of these in my shop. But the first one I built was comprised of cardboard, corgi car model parts, shaved toothpicks, anything I get my hands on. What happened in June of '71, I saw a TV Guide article where they featured the Lunar Rover, which was going to be used during the Apollo 15 mission that year. And when I saw this little dune buggy, I thought this was the coolest thing I've ever seen. I gotta have a model of this. I gotta make one. So I started making one because at that time I just picked up the scratch building technique. Scratch building is when you basically make something out of nothing. You take raw materials, you build it yourself. It's not a kit or anything prescribed. And I worked on this. And when I was finished with the little model, I was pretty proud of it. And I thought, you know, maybe this could come of use sometime. So I called up CBC and CTV, the news departments, told them what I had, and offered it to them for their use during their coverage of the Apollo 15 mission. Back during the Apollo program, the missions were big time. The news media is not what the media is today. They covered such events, and they covered them in a very big way. And they preempted programming and whatnot, and they showed not just highlights of the mission, but the moonwalks and so on and so forth. So anyway, I had offered this model to CBC, CTV. CBC calls me back the next day and basically says, thank you, appreciate the offer. We've got enough models coming up from NASA, but if we need you to pinch hit, could we call you? And I said, absolutely. I got off the phone, and at 17 years old, to have CBC News call you back, I felt pretty big about that. So I didn't hear anything from CTV until about the week before the launch of the actual mission. I got a message from my dad. I worked at a transport company loading and unloading trucks. It was a great job after 17. My dad was the night dispatcher, and he came up to start his shift, and he'd come up the dock and kind of, you know, always did his walk around to see what's going on and so on and so forth, and get organized for the evening shift. And I was there loading a truck with another fellow. He comes up to me and says, hey, Nick, this guy from CTV called, his name is Bob Conroy, wants to talk to you about that little model you built. So take a few minutes, go down. Nobody's in the offices anymore downstairs, give him a call. So I took the number, I went down to give him a call, and he was, at that time, the executive producer for W5, and wanted to see the model. So I took it up to the studios of CTV, living in Toronto at that time, where I was born and raised. Didn't live far from the CTV studios. And took it up there and showed it to him. He was very impressed. And he says, you know, what I really need is a whole landing site with the lunar module and the experiments. He says, you know what they're carrying on the mission? As a matter of fact, No, I don't. So he's got all of the press releases, the press kits as they call them, flight plans and so on and so forth for Apollo 15, a big thick document called the Lunar Surface Procedures, which the astronauts would use in their training to become familiar with their moonwalks. And that actually plotted out their whole stay on the moon. What they did, how they did it, where they put the experiments, and so on and so forth. So Bob Conroy throws all this down in front of me, he gets me a coffee, and he says, I want you to take some time and look through those documents and see if there's any of the experiments there. Okay? So I'm leafing through these documents and found them, told him, and he said, can you have those experiments with the LEM, your moon base, and this rover back here by Monday, 6 o'clock? We're talking Thursday afternoon, a few days before. And of course, being 17 years old and just taken aback by this, I said, sure, no problem. And so I went home and got to work. And by Sunday night, had everything finished, all the experiments and so on, and had it up to CTV at 6 o'clock the next morning. And they proceeded to use it, to use that model in the base during their coverage of the Apollo 15 mission. It looks similar to this, a little bit more scrunched up because the base was basically a 4x3, so we had to really condense everything in scale in terms of distance. But they managed to use it during the moonwalks, which was actually a few days later. And they paid me a handsome sum of $25 as a memento fee, which I didn't expect. But in 1971, it wasn't bad bucks for what I did. And so I took it and was grateful. And through that, I got to meet Harvey Kirk, who was the big news anchor of the day. Some of you may remember him. Henry Champ, who was a CTV news correspondent at that time. And a little story about him later on in the presentation. But that's when it started, and I thought, you know what, this is cool, I gotta do more of this stuff. This seems like fun. Well, 4 years later, in 1975, the Americans and Soviets at that time were meeting in space for the first time, and I did a model of that spacecraft, and it got offered it to CTV. They came back and they said, yes, we want to use it during our coverage. And so they did. But this time was a little more interesting twist. The fellow on the left you'll see is astronaut Scott Carpenter. He was one of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, and he came and co-anchored the coverage of the mission with Harvey Kirk, who's in the middle. That ungainly fellow to the right is yours truly, at the ripe old age of 21. Well, we didn't do anything after that for about 10 years. You know, at that time, I moved out west, or in some cases, some people would say, defected to the west, from Toronto, Ontario, and moved here and kind of settled in, got work, met my wife, got married, and had a couple of kids. But in 1984, we started up with the model making again. And it was in 1985, I scored a contract with Telesat Canada to build 2 operational models of their Anik C and Anik D satellites, which they were just putting up into space. Now, operating in the sense, no, they didn't work as a communication satellite. What these things did was actually show the deployment sequence. And this being what is known as a spin-stabilized satellite. In other words, it's a satellite that spins on its axis. It just rotates about 50 RPM. And in that time, the antenna, everything that you see on the top deck there remains stationary, so it's pointed at the Earth. But the body is rotating to stabilize the spacecraft. And what we did was we built models that showed the actual deployment sequence. So this thing would start, you turn around, it would start spinning, the main dish would deploy, the bottom skirt, which would be covering the top skirt, would drop, all while this thing was spinning. And it took us almost a year to do. But we did 2 of them for Telesat, and 1 for Spar Aerospace, which is now McDonald Denmark. And that was in 85 and 86. And at the same time, we scored a contract. In fact, it was the day my daughter Deanna was born. September 10th, 1985, I'll never forget the morning. And I'm at home by myself. Connie was already in the hospital, gave birth to Deanna, just got up, had a coffee. Courier comes to the door with an envelope. Never expecting this. It was a contract from the Canadian government to build a model of the then U.S. space station, along with a new Canadian satellite concept called MSAT, for mobile satellite. And this was to, this satellite concept was to develop mobile communications, primarily across Canada. So we got the contracts to build these. So we built this this model here, which was mainly out of aircraft aluminum, steel, wood, plastic, you name it, anything we get our hands on. And I designed it as a model. It spans 28.5 feet across its wingspan, and it is still on record as the largest model I've built. We've done 2 that come close to it, but not quite. This is still the largest one. That was done, and as you see it here, it's hanging in the Canada Pavilion at Expo 86 in Vancouver. The other model we got a contract for was the U.S. space station, as it was known at that time, was called Freedom. And this model actually, although I was living in Coquitlam at the time, this particular model was built in West Sechelt. Connie's dad was quite interested and quite talented with his hands, and I got him involved in actually giving me a hand to build this model. And he worked on the truss segment. And that truss segment on this model is not 3D printed, not laser cut, anything. It's actually put together in 30-inch sections, piece by piece. It's a very long, arduous, laborious task. But it was done, we put it together, got her down to the Canadian Pavilion, and it took a day to hang that thing. Little side note, we were doing this project at the time of the Challenger accident. And I was like Challenger. I don't know, just something about the Space Shuttle Challenger that I really liked. I just liked the name Challenger, and I found out later on it was one of the astronauts' favorites, actually. And this shuttle was going to be called Challenger. We actually, after the accident, didn't think it would be in good taste to name it Challenger because it wasn't around anymore. We actually drew names and it became Atlantis. So we named it Atlantis. But that hung in the Canada Pavilion at Expo 86 also.
How heavy would that be?
That's a good question. Never weighed it. The shuttle itself was carved out of foam, and then we clad it on the outside. And then the station itself was, the modules were 2 with ends that we machined. And then with the truss and everything. To be honest with you, I don't know what that weighed. It was not a heavy model. Not like MSAT. MSAT was quite heavy. We had at one point 3 guys up on scaffolds hanging that one up. Well, I didn't do any more model making until 1994. In 1994, I'm actually showing a slide a little early, but in 1994, I kind of rediscovered model making because, again, I was away from it for another 9 years. And I rediscovered model making by unpacking some models that had come out with me. Way back in 1977, I stumbled upon this box. I was about to turn 40 that year, and I kind of rediscovered model making. I thought, hey, it's time to build my own collection. And then I thought at the time, you know what, I gotta stick an ad in a magazine. I gotta find a magazine somewhere to put an ad in. Maybe I could get some commissions on the side, make some extra money out of this. So a magazine that I enjoyed reading and I subscribed to was Final Frontier magazine at the time. It was a space magazine. It was all about space flight and space travel. So I put an ad in that magazine, and the calls started coming in, and the orders started coming in. And thus you have the birth of what is known today as Proach models. Started in November of 1994, so we are celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. And so we started building models, we started getting commissions, and then in May of '95, we got a 110 model project for a children's science center in San Juan, Puerto Rico. We did 110 models. It took a year and a half, and 2 of us doing those models. They're going 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Yes?
Question. I was at a air museum near Tucson, Arizona. They had a
That's
lot.
Pima?
Yeah, they
Pima
had a lot of
Aerospace
models
Museum.
in there. Were any of those yours?
No, not Pima.
No, eh?
No.
Boy, that was neat. though.
Yeah, that's a cool place. Been down there a few
Hundreds
times.
of photos of it.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. So so 94, 95 was busy, 96 was busy. Coming into 1997, I got a chance to finally go down to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And I hate to admit it to you, but that was my first time ever at the Kennedy Space Center. I have followed the program, the space program, since I was 7 years old. I can recall when Alan Shepard was launched into space back in '61. And I've been wanting to get down there for many years. And in January of '97, I was actually flown down there to take a couple of models, and they were used in the commemoration ceremonies, the 30th anniversary of the Apollo 1 accident, and that's where Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee lost their lives during a fire in the capsule 3 weeks before their scheduled launch at the beginning of the Apollo program. So this was the scene right at pad 34 at 6:31, the night of January 27th, 1997. You can see the Saturn 1B model standing up with the capsule beside it. And they used that during their ceremonies, and the model was left behind at the Astronaut Memorial Foundation at the Kennedy Space Center. Now at the same time, okay, there's a rendition of the Apollo 1 guys. At the same time, we were commissioned by HBO to do a series of models for a series which Tom Hanks produced called From the Earth to the Moon. I don't know if any of you ever saw that. You ever see that series? Most of the backdrop models used in that series were built here, that we built.
Cool.
And that was going on at that time as well. So we always had a lot of jobs, a lot of projects in the mix going on at the same time. How I got through a lot of these projects, I don't know. Certainly the grace of God had something to do with it, I have to say, because it can get very, it can really spin your head sometimes when you're doing that many jobs at once. And at this point, I have help, and you're not only doing the work yourself, but you're supervising it as well. This was one particular scene in the first episode, and this was a scene where it actually happened. In the real Apollo 1 story, they had a lot of problems with the spacecraft. And the crew finally were sitting down one day in front of this model, and they posed like this. A picture was taken of them, and when the 8x10 came back, the crew signed it with a little clause on it stating to the director of the Apollo program at that time, sorry, but we decided to take our concerns to a higher power. And that actually existed, and I've seen the actual photograph. This was a scene in the first episode of the 12-episode miniseries. And the capsule that you see them praying in front of was built right here. That you call a command module. Now at the same time, we also did a window display for HBO New York, and this is one of the 2 models we did. It's a 1/12 scale lunar module. 1/12 scale, the thing sat about 2 feet tall. Not even about that tall, compared to the surface of the table. Totally scratch built. There's not a part in existence in that scale for this. And of course, we have the plans and the documentation with which to build all of these, wonderful pieces. And this is a pretty popular shot. Dan McCormick, who was my photographer at the time, lived here in Sechelt, and took this picture. And he says, "Put your flight jacket on and inspect the model." And there you see the picture. This model went to New York. It got there in one piece and actually was a very easy pack. It actually sits in a cradle in which four foam pieces come out and grab quads of the descent stage. And there's a piece of foam sitting at the top. That thing would grab anywhere during transit. And it got to New York in one piece. Now we're deeper into 1998, and I have my second chance to go down to the Kennedy Space Center, but this time it's a little different. We're going to see some fireworks this time. We're going to see John Glenn take off in the Space Shuttle Discovery. And man, what an experience that was. This was the night before launch. I was at a pre-launch reception. I had to excuse myself and head back out to the Kennedy Space Center to meet with Miles and Walter. Because at the time, we also ran a contest with CNN. We actually collaborated with CNN, and we're giving away models during the course of the coverage of that mission. So we built the models, we supplied them to CNN, and there was a contest, we gave them away. And these models that you see in front, Shuttle, the Mercury Atlas, the capsule, the large Atlas, the far right there, where the technician there is irritating Walter as he puts his earpiece in. We supplied those models for contest. And of course, this was an excellent photo opportunity just minutes before these guys went on the air. And that was the night before launch. The day of the launch, had great pleasure running into a number of astronauts. This one is former Canadian astronaut and currently our Governor General, Julie Payette. And ran into many other astronauts that day. This was, of course, at the Kennedy Space Center, the press site, which is 3.5 miles from the pad. That's the closest you could get to the pad, except if you were Air Force rescue personnel, which would be in an underground bunker a mile away.
Wow.
But to be in the open air, this was the closest you could get. And I just want to explain to you what the sensation of the launch is like. It can get almost emotional. I say that because when you see this thing light up, and it's at the point of liftoff, you don't hear a thing. You're 3.5 miles away from this. You don't hear anything. And all of a sudden, you start to hear a very faint number. And it just keeps getting louder, and louder, and louder, and louder. And finally, it's you right there. You can actually feel your innards rumble. That's how loud that is. If you were any closer to that launch, you would die of a convulsion because you couldn't take it. The loudness would be just so tremendous, you couldn't take it. But I was able to watch that thing ascend into the heavens and actually watch the 2 solid rocket boosters separate with my naked eye. When that thing went off, I just stood there and watched it. Like nothing else mattered. I'm just watching this thing.
Was there any vibration down there, or just noise?
A lot of noise. There was vibration. Like it shook everything and everybody. And it shook you on the inside. And when it hit you on the inside, you had to scream. And what did you scream? Go. Just go, you were right into it. But I will say that if you duck behind the bleachers for a pee, in a minute and a half, it's all over.
Wow.
It's gone. You, like, once it's up there, you don't hear it anymore. It's up there. Not that I or anybody else duck behind the bleachers for a pee, but I'm just saying.
Just saying.
Anyway, after the launch and after everything was said and done, I went into the news center and I saw this fellow and I recognized him right away. This is Henry Champ. This is the guy that I got to meet and collaborate with on the CTV model back in 1971. And he didn't look like he changed a bit. I went up to him and I says, Henry Champ. He says, yes, sir. And Henry was always a very pleasant guy. And he was at the time working with CBC News World. He was a Washington correspondent. He was assigned to cover this launch. Anyway, go up to him and says, Henry, do you recall back in July 1971, this young 17-year-old comes up to CTV with a whole bunch of models, the whole lunar surface layout. And he did this for CTV for you and Harvey Kerr. He looks at me, he says, yes, I do remember. You were that young guy, weren't you? I said, yeah, I was. That was a really neat reunion, him and I. So we talked for a few minutes and he told me what he was up to and I told him what I was up to and stuff like that. And then we finally, before we parted ways, took this picture right in front of the NASA News Center at the press site of the Kennedy Space Center. So that was 98, 1999, 2000, 2001. We got heavily involved with building the individual components of the International Space Station for the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston. And what they use these individual elements for is they were very highly detailed pieces. We're going to see one in a few minutes. But they're very highly detailed pieces of the truss segments. That one long truss, which is 360 feet long down in space, was put together in a number of segments. And we had to do the segments in their actual form. And they had to have handholds, boot sockets, which are called whip sockets or work interface sockets, electrical connections, had to be all indicated on there with code. And what these models would be used for is they'd be used by the astronauts who were actually going up there to the spacewalk to assemble the space station. So they would actually plan what is called a translation path, or where they actually walk in space. When they get out there and float around, they're just not floating around for kicks. They know exactly where they're going and what they're doing. So they would use these models to train on. I'm just going to advance this a little bit so that we can see what we're talking about. There's one segment there, the S1 truss. I'll come back to the others in a moment. They would use these pieces to plot out their walk. And then they go over to the neutral buoyancy lab, suit up. And that's the world's largest swimming pool. It's 40 feet deep. And they go down in the swimming pool where they can practice weightlessness. And they practice their spacewalk based on what they train on these models. So we did a whole series of models of the Johnson Space Center between 99 and 02. During that time also, let's see if we can go back now. There we are. During that time also, this fellow by the name of Alan Bean calls me up. He calls me up on a Thursday evening. And Alan was on the second landing crew. He was on the Apollo 12 mission in November of '69. They're just about to celebrate the 50th anniversary. Calls me up in an evening and asked me about the possibility of doing a model of this. Surveyor 3. Surveyor 3 was an unmanned craft that landed on the Ocean of Storms on the moon in 1967. Him and Pete Conrad landed 600 feet away from this spacecraft in 1969 during the Apollo 12 mission. On their second moonwalk, they walked over to it, pulled some parts off of it, including a scoop and a TV camera, brought them back to Earth, where they have been in the Smithsonian for some time. I don't know if they're still there anymore, but they were there for some time. Anyway, Alan wanted me to do this model, so I priced it out for him. And it took us 2 years to build. The reason being is I could not find one blueprint on Surveyor 3. Not one. I had to rely on Alan and his photo library and his very, very sharp memory of this, of the spacecraft. And I was able to draw up a set of plans for it. And we built this model at 1/7 scale. 1/7 scale is about 19 inches in between the 3 footpads. So it was a nice size piece. And it took a long time to build. When I worked with Alan, he wanted to see every phase of the model as it was being built. So we would send photos. Internet, yeah, we were doing internet at the time, but we did photos as well and send out to him. And then we would converse and maybe have to change a few things or whatever. This particular model, the entire frame was built out of brass, silver solder. And then a lot of the appendages, like the boxes and so on, were made and we molded and cast on polyurethane resin. And this particular model is in what used to be my driveway right in front of my house. We thought it would make an excellent home service, and just took a whole bunch of pictures of it before we sent it off. There are only 2 models like this in existence. We built them both right here. And that's me with Alan Bean at his place in 2004 with the model.
That model in the background, it looked like the model, the one you showed us earlier.
No, that model there was about like that. That was a big model. Yeah.
You didn't build that?
No, I didn't build that one. But I built a little one that's in between us here. You can see Surveyor 3
Yeah.
right in between us there. And if I ever remember which key to use here. There we go. Now, when I was at his place in 2004, where that last picture was taken, he excused himself for a moment, and in his home, I was actually in his studio. He was a very accomplished painter, and he painted of his experiences on the moon. Very accomplished artist. So anyway, a friend of mine and myself were standing in his studio, and he had this fireplace, freestanding fireplace, right in the middle of his studio, that kind of separated one side from the other. And he had this weird-looking hammer sitting on his fireplace mat. And I said to my friend, I says, hey, wow, this must be his training hammer. And I says, hey, yeah, they let you keep the training hammer, eh? He says, he comes walking by, sorry, what did you say? I says, your training hammer. NASA let you keep the training hammer? He says, no, that's not my training hammer, that's the one I used. Pardon me? That's the one I used on the moon. His hammer's been on the surface of the moon. He says, yeah. Do you mind if I said, oh, sure, go ahead, pick it up. So I picked it up, and I'm looking at this thing. I say to my friend Rob, I says, Rob, I'm never going to wash my hands again. This guy has just touched the moon. I would walk on it, but I've touched it. This thing was on the moon. So I turned to Al and I says, Al, I gotta have a picture of you. Do you mind? He says, not at all, Nick. Hence the picture was taken, and then my friend also kind of, we just took turns taking pictures of each other, holding this hammer, which was on the Ocean of Storms in 1969. So that's what I say on my website, is that I didn't walk on the moon, but I touched it. Touched the moon. gotta get used to these keys yet. There we go. Now, a few of these slides are a little bit mixed up. I just put the presentation together. It's the first time I'm presenting it. So some of these are a little out of whack. In 2000, we did 50 of these bumpers, as they're called, to commemorate the very first launch from Cape Canaveral Air Station, which was in July 1950. Bumper is a V2. It's a German V2 rocket, which was captured by the Americans during the end of the war, when von Braun came over to the U.S. and agreed to work with the government to put a man in space. They put a Wac Corporal missile on the nose of it, and it was used in atmospheric research. So one of the very, very first atmospheric researches ever done was done for this rocket. It was launched from Cape Canaveral. And there is a difference too. You hear Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center. Oh, it's the same thing, isn't it? No, it's not. The Kennedy Space Center is the civilian spaceport. This is where the Saturns were launched to the moon, the shuttles were launched from. This is where SpaceX is now launching their Falcon 9s and Falcon Heavies from. And I believe, no, that's it. And then from the Cape Canaveral side, that's the Air Force side, Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. And that's where a lot of these unmanned Delta rockets and Atlas rockets, Boeing will launch their manned capsule next year from the Air Force side. So that's the difference between the two. I just wanted to throw that in there. Now we're getting back to this truss, the space station components. This actual model was flown aboard the Shuttle lands at the space station in October of 2002 to be used during an in-flight press conference. And that in-flight press conference happened on a Friday night. And I got home, I forget where I was, but I got home, and my friend Robert he's now in California, but he's former at NASA, had called me up and he says, Nick, get on the NASA site. You'll actually see them using the model during their TV transmission. So anyway, I watched the whole press conference, saw the model just all of a sudden float into view, and these guys were handling it and showing it off and so on and so forth, because that is the segment that they put in place aboard the ISS, the International Space Station, during that particular flight. And that is the picture that I got, and you can see the entire crew, and in the forefront is our 12-inch long model of the S1 truss floating around in space, or the mid-deck of the Shuttle Atlantis. And this is what it was at the International Space Station. A few months later, one of the Saturn jobs I had to do is supply models of the shuttle to various television outlets as they tried to explain the Columbia accident. And that's where Columbia disintegrated during re-entry, and its entire crew was killed. And that is just one of the pictures that was actually sent to me. This fellow was from a TV station in Florida, in Orlando at the time. At the same time, we got a contract from Northrop Grumman, or from TRW, which is today Northrop Grumman, in California, to build 75 of the Chandra X-ray observatories. And when they came to me and wanted models to be able to sell to the crew that built the Chandra and put it in space, I had to take a pre-order on that, and I said, listen, if we hit 40, that's the price. We got an order for 75 of them. Can we put them together? And that's just one shot. Unfortunately, this afternoon, I was looking through some more photos because I found a memory stick that I thought I lost. And I checked it out, and had tons of pictures on it. And it shows the entire assembly process of these models. And it was too late to add to this program, but maybe we can do that another time. But He built 75 of these on my little 13 by 18 shop on the back in 2002. Oh, that's my cat Beauty. Probably wondering, what is this cat doing in this presentation? Well, number one, I wanted to throw it in there more as a joke than anything else. I thought I'd get a rise out of you guys.
Everybody looks
I throw a
good.
picture of my cat in there. But went upstairs for lunch one day, come back downstairs, because my office was in the house, and I couldn't believe it. She's sitting right on top of that monitor in our home office, and looking right at me. And I passed her sat nice and warm. Yep. And she loved it. So I called her my office manager. She was my office manager. Now we go to 2008. You're going to find the pictures now are better order now, because I probably got the hang of this powerful thing at this point. Anyway, November 2008, it was earlier in 08 that I was contacted by Richard Gary. He's the son of one of the earlier NASA astronauts. And Richard was one of the private guys that would take a ride on a Soyuz capsule to the International Space Station. And he actually phoned me to tell me about it, that he was selected and he's going to be going up in November. And a couple of months later, contacted me and said, Nick, I'm going to be doing a little art show while I'm up there. It'd sure be nice if I could take a little model. And I thought, hey, fly a Russian Soyuz spacecraft? Sure, let's do it. We are the only company today that has a distinction in this area anyway, of launching a product on a U.S. space shuttle and a Russian Soyuz spacecraft. This little guy, that as you can see, was sitting in the palm of your hand, and the actual spacecraft itself was maybe not quite an inch and a half long. It had to be very, very small. And we made that, I made that on a weekend, sent it off to Richard, and he took it up into space. And there it is aboard the Japanese module on the International Space Station during his workshop. In fact, just out of interest's sake, I'm doing another project for him right now. He contacted me a few weeks ago, wants me to do a model for him. And I have no idea what that other thing is beside it. And it was in 2008, we finally got the golden phone call from SpaceX. I've talked to these guys for a few years. Finally got a call, and they wanted us to do 12 of their Falcon 1 rockets. And we did. They liked them, so much so that the next contract we got from them was for 50 of these guys. This is their first version of a Falcon 9, the cargo rocket. You can tell it's a cargo rocket by the big bulbous nose hole. And we did 50 of those in 2010. And remember earlier I said, you know, we're always doing a number of projects at once, and it can really make your head spin. But at the same time, we were doing this guy. Doing a 16-foot tall Saturn V for a museum in Colombia. And at the same time, we did 3 other rockets, American manned rockets, which would not even reach the height of myself. That just gives you an idea just how big the Saturn rocket really is. This thing here, almost 16 feet tall. And the fellow that's standing with me, he owns Can Crate Industries in Burnaby. He does all of our crates. If we do a model that requires a crate, he's the guy that gets the job. In this particular case, he actually packed this thing over there. Because there's no way I was going to bring it back here and attempt to pack it myself. Now when you only have a shop 18 feet long and 13 feet wide. We didn't have the facilities at that time that we do today. 2011, we commemorated 50 years of man in space by doing an exhibit at the Pacific Space Center you know it better as the planetary backroom. And that was in the downstairs display case. And then in 2012, ran into my good friend Alan Bean again at a show in Tucson. And that's one of the times I did the PMA and Space Museum when I was down there. And he wanted a model of the Lunar Rover in scale with the Surveyor 3. That rover was about that long. And it's a model of the Apollo 15 rover. Naturally, a subject very near and dear to my heart. And so we dug out all the plans, the drawings, and so on and so forth, and started going to town on it. The chassis is entirely made of metal. All the joints there that you see there on the suspension system, all metal, all silver soldered by a ticketed jewelers, goldsmith jeweler, who I employed at the time. The high gain antenna, the new gold antenna, a lot of the tools, tool rack in the back, all the tools, all done out of metal. Fenders out of fiberglass, the wheels were casted. And that is done right in specs. And again, the moonscape in front of my house made a perfect backdrop for this. Had to take a couple pictures of this before we printed it off and sent it off. You know, this segment was part of an original PowerPoint, and I wanted to leave it in because the Saturn V 8-foot model I would do, you would think for $8,000 US you would sell very many of them, and we sell them 1 or 2 a year. And it's a popular model. And it's another thing, you know, the number one question I'm always asked is, how do you get started in models? The number 2 question is, how do you build that? And this is a perfect model to take you through how we actually build it. If you look closely, you'll see a shuttle in the backdrop, the same scale we built at the same time. But when we build a Saturn V, number 1, it's entirely scratch built. There's not a single part that we buy prepaid. Everything we have done here, done all the masters, the molds, the castings, the main bodies out of the tube. Tube alone in this model is worth $400. That's just the tube alone. And that, we haven't done anything to it. Okay? The plastic that we use is butyrate. Corrugations are computer cut vinyl. And you take large sections like the interstage here, which is molded fiberglass. The big mold, we don't actually pour that because we pour that piece solid to weigh a ton. So we lay it up with fiberglass. The model is finished in enamel paints, so it can be handled. And all the markings, when you see it in its finished state, are all sign quality vinyl. This is at the time I started photographing this because again I got asked by a lot of people, boy, we'd love to see your work in progress. So we thought, okay, we're going to do that. Some of the parts we actually, you can notice on one side there is sprayed primer. We do that to seal the parts, and we also do it to note any imperfections, anything that may have to be sanded, filled, or even replaced. And we do that because we take our work very, very seriously. We want these pieces, I want these pieces all built as if it was going to be in my own private collection. And this is what I want people to receive. And we use gray paint because gray paint will show up any imperfection. Gray primer. It's the same as what they use in body shops. And then we do a test fit, what we call an all-op. Put the whole thing together to make sure it fits together right. That stage sections aren't too tight to fit into one another. Everything goes together really, really well because when this is painted, the last thing we want to do is start sanding or making things fit. They got to already fit. Because we don't want to do that once they're all nice and finished and painted. So So we do it all up just to make sure everything is fit. And once it's fit, then off to the paint shop she goes. In 2012, we were contracted by Spacex to do 50 of these guys that drag in one cargo vehicle. This is the little spacecraft that they sent up to the International Space Station. That's what a master looks like. By the time we're ready to put it into a mold, it's all gray primed. Then again, it's checked over for imperfections. It's repaired, filled, touched up, whatever has to be done. And by the time 2012 rolled around, believe it or not, this little guy was the most expensive investment in a model I've ever made. Just to get the master parts ready to mold, $4,000. And this was just prior to the advent of 3D printing. This model was all done by hand, right here on the coast. Just by contrast, the new Dragon 2 crew capsule, which will actually launch next year, we are working currently with SpaceX to get that approved. All those master parts have been 3D printed. This is what a final assembly starts looking like when you have that many models. And you can see these little guys here at various stages of development. You've got some finished, just waiting for windows. You've got others waiting for the markings. And you have what's known as the trunks, the aft part of the spacecraft, ready to or waiting to be made into the capsule portion. This is kind of a cool shot I took. I said to the guys in the shop, I says, hey, look at this. It looks like they're all wearing party hats. And what that is actually is we want to protect the nose section, which is all gold foiled and painted at the top. We don't want that getting hit by the decal fixative, which dulls the finish. We don't want that. So what we do is we just take some painter's tape, wrap around, and squeeze it together, and that gives it enough protection from the fixative. We actually will put that capsule into a large cup and it protects the heat shield, silver heat shield, from the same thing. And we're able to spray the fixative over those markings because those markings are dry transfer. They're the Roman type with Electroset. And that's what SpaceX, that's the specification of SpaceX. They want all their models to have markings that are dry transfers. So whatever the customer wants, the customer gets. No questions asked. We don't necessarily like doing some things all the time, but we do what the customer wants. The wing itself was quite a job. So we finally settled on a material I'm simply going to call what we call in the shop as PET-G. It's the same plastic that Coke pop bottles are made from. Very thin plastic. It's clear, and we have the decals actually printed, and they're laid up on this plastic sheet, and that's what makes them the solar wing. And then you have Dragon models here, ready for packing. We've left the protective film on the wings. The customer takes it off when they get to their end destination. We just want to protect them, or make sure they're protected in transit. 2013, more work from SpaceX. We did 8 9-foot tall models, 2 heavies. And the heavy was the one launched early last year where it launched a car into solar orbit. And Falcon 9s, that's the one they usually launch. And that was just outside of my little shop in West Sechelt. This is just a few months before we went up Sechelt up Road, at least where our shop is currently. And I'll tell you why that happened too. We sent these models out, someone got damaged. Not our fault. And they all had to come back to us, 8 of these things, and they're in like 10-foot long crates. And of course, coming back here in the month of December, a little 18 by 13 shop, not gonna work. So I had to actually go rent some space for a couple of months just to fix these things. And we rented one of the bays up where we are now. And I actually enjoyed working up there. I came back and said to my wife Connie, I said, you know, I gotta be honest, it's kind of nice to go somewhere else to work for a change. It's just a change of pace. And what do you mean? I says, I like that space. I want that space. So anyway, we thought, well, maybe we better wait for another contract to come on. Well, 2 weeks later, another contract from Spacex, so we made the deal to take Bay 3, and shortly after that, we took the baby side, and that's where we are today. But this was the model that basically constituted that change. The little shop on my property now is the paint shop. That's where all the model goes. All the models go to get painted and finished, take it back to the main shop now where they're packed and shipped from there. This was a model we did in the new shop. It is a half-scale model. Half-scale, you're looking at about 5 feet long and about 3 feet across. This is the body of a satellite which is called NEXT. It is a constellation of 66 satellites that are currently in Earth orbit in different varying orbits, which are known as sun-synchronous or polar orbit. They go around, so they cover about almost 100% of the Earth's surface. And they are used for aviation and nautical communications. Apparently with this new generation of satellite, there will be no more Malaysia Air, forget that flight number, the one that went missing and they never found it. Yeah, no more of those. So these cover the entire network, and they talk to each other. You can be over here, and they'll talk to that satellite, we'll talk to that satellite, we'll talk to the ground and say, okay, Charles is over here. And they know exactly where he is, and so on and so forth. So we built 6 of these for Iridium. We built, how many of the little guys? We did them in 2 or 3 different scales. We did them in half scale, 12th scale. We did 20 of them in 12th scale. I think we did about 60 of them in a smaller desktop scale. That was 2015, 2016. These are models hanging in one of their lobbies. Yes.
Just a coincidence or the name of Iridium, we see these flares sometimes when we're looking up with our telescopes, they're really bright flashes. Do you think it might be those satellites?
Is it a satellite you're looking at?
Yeah, Danny, it's the same company, but 2 different.
Different satellites, same company. I just went because we call them Iridium flares, and I didn't know if it was because of the currency.
Oh, no, that would be a different thing.
There's a couple of buses off of me,
Yeah.
40 degrees, they reflect the light down, the kids, it's just the right way it flares.
Yeah, these are owned by Iridium Communications. They're called NEXT. I don't know what NEXT stands for. They never told me that. We did 60 of these puppies for SpaceX last year. And 45 of them are sitting on the main table in the workshop. And I just had to take a picture of them. 45 of them guys, all finished, waiting to be packed. How long did it take to pack those guys? We do the boxes and cut the foam off all in one day. Then we go back the next day and tie them all in. They go in crates and they're taken off to the airport. Now, after all this, and after many years actually, dreaming about this and considering this and kicking it around, the question is, how about a space model museum right here on the Sunshine Coast? Okay. It's been a dream of mine for a long time. I never knew where I would set it up, or how I would set it up, or whatever. But we've got the makings, I would say we've got the nucleus of one started. And what I would really love to see come through is a story in model form of spaceflight, manned and unmanned. I'm talking real spaceflight. And not only with models, but eventually we could incorporate artifacts. We could bring in the spacesuit. I would like affiliations with the two main agencies in North America, primarily with everybody, actually, if I could. But this is what we'd like to see as a next step, along with the business. So we would have this in the same building where the workshop is. Is anyone coming through? If you come through our facilities, and I invite you to do that, just give me a call anytime. I'll have cards up here with my number. You can buy anytime. Call me in advance, make an appointment. I'll take you through and give you the whole tour. And there is a little museum there already. We'll take out the back rooms in the shop and show you what's happening. Well, we want to develop a museum not only out of the interest that I have for it, but we see two big things coming out of a museum like this. And I'm just going to take a minute before I wrap up and just explain this. Number one, it's nice to be able to see people pick up tools and start creating things again. Too much today is being done on a computer. And for a guy that's learned with his hands and basically, and I admit, and I'm very proud to admit, I'm an old school guy, nice to see people creating things with their hands. That's one of the neat things about this coast is that there's so many artists, and so many very good artists creating things with their hands. But we really want to push this. And when people come in and see our space models, it really is invigorating and inspiring. And this is what we want to do. We also, by doing this, want to encourage the youth to do this, to pick up tools, start creating things with their hands. Along the way, I have inspired young people to build models, and it's been a lot of fun. And the other thing, too, it tells the story of what has happened and why it's happened. Yes, a lot of it's political. I get that. But the positive is there's been a lot of good stuff that's come out of the space program for you and I right here on Earth. And that story is not being told. And it should be. And we'd like to tell you the story. But like anything, it takes money. It takes help. And if you can make a donation, you can visit our website, spacemodel.com. Come by and see what we have. Or if there's a way you can help out, please let me know. Love to hear from you. I want to thank you again. I hope you found this interesting. And we'll do it again sometime. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. He has cards up here. He has an album showing you some of the stuff in the shop. I would encourage you to take this invitation and go and check out his museum there. It's absolutely amazing. Bruce, you got to get
Well, thank you very much for coming, and Nick, thank you very much for your presentation. And that was very, very interesting, and it's neat to see how you started out this far, and maybe take to heart his dream to see SpaceX on. So, thank you.
Oh, yeah.